history of war. You said you're a
World
war
War
scholar.
II,
You've been
Piers,
to
how many
Gaza
civilians
6
died in World
times.
War II,
Right?
Piers?
You have stated
How do you know?
the ratio is the best we've seen. I've asked you multiple times how many civilians have been killed, and you don't know. Therefore, you don't know the ratio. Therefore, your assessment is bullshit.
Watch him get caught. Not by an activist. Not by a pundit. By Piers Morgan asking the same simple question 5 times in a row. John Spencer sits down calling himself a war scholar. 6 trips to Gaza, 100 interviews, division commanders, battalion commanders. And he tells Piers the IDF has the best civilian-to-combatant ratio in modern military history. A huge claim. A claim that only works if you actually know 2 numbers. So Piers asks for them. How many civilians have been killed? How many Hamas? And that's where it falls apart. Watch Spencer reach for kindergarten math, subtracting a number he won't say from a number he won't say. Watch him list every credential he has except the one thing his entire argument requires, an actual figure. 4 times, 5 times, Piers asks the same question. Every time, Spencer talks around it. If you've ever watched someone build a whole argument on a statistic they never actually had, I want you to see how long it takes Piers to expose that here. It's not long. If you're tired of confident men with big titles getting away with numbers that don't exist, subscribe to The Honest Perspective. We ask for the receipts, and we don't let the question get changed. I'm Neil. This is The Honest Perspective. A war scholar who can't name the dead isn't an expert. He's a talking point. Let's get into it.
Well, joining me now is John Spencer, Executive Director of the Urban Warfare Institute. John, thanks for coming on the show. You've been on before. I appreciate you coming back. We had a little exchange on X, and you laid out a very firm conviction that in your estimation, the IDF is the most moral army in the world. And I was struck really, I guess, by the fact that all the people that you cited who you'd spoken to were, of course, on the pro-Israel, pro-IDF side. So, of course, they're going to say that. And the criticism that I would level back at you about your claim was simply that if you're only going to do that, talk to the people that are effectively have a horse in the race, and journalists aren't allowed into Gaza to work it out for themselves, then it's hard to believe it. What would you say to that?
Well, hi, Piers. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate you in doing that. I will have to correct you on misquoting me. That quote about being the most moral military in the world, that's probably from my friend Colonel Richard Kemp from the British Army, who led Afghanistan forces during the Afghan war. My quote that you called nonsense was that the Israel and the IDF have implemented more measures to prevent civilian harm than any military in history. Now, that's a provable fact. You asked about the people I've interviewed. So over 100 interviews, although your previous guest said that he had 14 interviews resting on 3 journal articles. And I wish I would have a New York Times spread based on hundreds of interviews. And I listed them for you in that X post, not just the prime minister, both chiefs of the IDF, every division commander in Gaza, battalion commander, company commander, doing what we call primary source resource. So I'm not asking them.
But they would all say that, John, wouldn't they? I mean, my instant reaction when I read it was, of course they're going to say that to you. Of course they're going to present. They're going to present a series of facts to you which endorse this belief that, whether you call them the most moral army in the world or whether you call them the one that has, spared the most civilians, when the reality on the ground, and I think it's why Netanyahu won't let journalists into Gaza to operate freely, the reality is very different. As even Donald Trump said last week, why do they keep levelling whole buildings to go after one Hamas guy or a couple of Hezbollah people, right? They are, in the process of targeting the enemy, they are killing enormous numbers of civilians. Now, I've had people say to me, yeah, but what about World War II? What about Dresden? All that. I completely agree. But of course, that was precisely why the Geneva Convention was brought in, to prevent that kind of thing happening again. And many people think that the IDF has been indiscriminate, not because they're deliberately targeting civilians, but because they are targeting 1, 2, 3 enemy combatants, and in the process killing huge numbers of civilians. And, whether you call that targeting civilians or willfully ignoring the civilian casualty reality on the ground, I mean, it makes little difference to the victims, does it?
So it's a great question. So post-World War II, but let me address your question about me just doing interviews. Since I have traveled, and I mentioned this to you, although you argue that journalists can't go into Gaza unless
They can't go in freely.
Freely, right. So you want them to embed with Hamas.
Well, I want them to do their jobs as they do in every war zone in the world. I mean, these are people who do this as a matter of course. I know a number of war correspondents. They've never had a situation where, particularly when it moved to a supposed ceasefire, they're still not being allowed in. I think I know why they're not being allowed in. And I'm curious whether you share my concern that there can be only one reason why a government wouldn't want journalists to operate freely when there's a ceasefire, and that is because they do not want people to know what really happened.
No, so I wouldn't agree with that assessment, although there are other combat zones, and you and I have actually discussed Ukraine and the coverage that I've had in Ukraine, on the front line of Ukraine, where journalists aren't allowed. So it's not that this is a unique, and the probable answer on why isn't just what you listed, but the embeds that I have done. I'm not a reporter, I'm a war scholar. I went into Gaza multiple times, over 6 times. So when I was asking a division commander, what are you doing here? I'm actually also watching them operate. And to your previous guest's question, which I really want to talk about, is that you and others have pinned me as the only person, right? I'm the only one that says this thing when there's actually
I didn't say that. I didn't say that. Nick
did.
Said that.
Your previous guest, right?
Yeah.
So do you know Sir John McCall? I know you've been on a panel with him, right? The former deputy NATO Supreme Commander, who was very skeptical, almost had similar thoughts to you, then went to Gaza, went into Gaza with 6 other NATO members and came out and said, no, the harm mitigation measures, which is really important because we're going to talk about post-World War II. Would you call the Korean War a genocide, Piers?
Well, I think the definition of the reason I have held off calling what happened in Gaza a genocide is because actually no country / state has ever been found guilty of waging a genocide. That's just a fact as a country, right? So, I think that it's important that when people throw these kind of words around, they understand what it means and they wait for a proper adjudication by proper authorities on whether it meets the criteria for genocide. I have used the phrase ethnic cleansing because I think that is more pertinent to the language, particularly we see from certain members of the Israeli government. But and let's be honest, John, when you saw that statement from Ben Gvir about Lebanon and burning it to the ground, that is the language of a genocidal maniac.
It is, but I don't want to live in the world where outlier politicians that make statements that if you took them.
But he's the security minister of Israel.
I think Naftali Bennett replied to your ex-post and said he made that title
but he didn't answer
himself.
that point. And I replied to him saying, but hang on, this guy is the security minister for Israel. That is his job in the government. He's not a fringe member of the government. He's actually the security minister.
That title, though, isn't what you're inferring. That's what Naftali Bennett, no friend of Netanyahu, said.
No, he's not.
That's more like the head of the police. He's not in the chain of command. So when you criticize that list of people, I was demonstrating that I've interviewed or observed in combat operations both the political leaders that in the chain of command and the actual field commanders operating and watching them take in extraordinary steps that no military has done.
But do you think, John, so John, on that point...
Piers, you said post-World War II. Can I answer that really quick?
Sure.
Because you said the Korean War, right? So, yes.
You said the Korean War. I didn't mention it.
In World War II, Dresden, even the Blitz of... we don't do that anymore, right? The Geneva Conventions. The Korean War was a 37-month war. 2 million civilians were killed in that war. That's 54,000 civilians a month, every month of the war, 2,000 civilians a day, more than actual combatants. These numbers, these lies, damn lies, statistics, even if we want to talk about the numbers of children, which is, according to the United Nations, anybody below the age of 18, half of the population of Gaza is below the age of 18. And Hamas is historic for deploying soldiers from 12 to 18. The average age of a Hamas recruit right now is 16.
But do you believe, but John, do you believe that the ratio of civilian deaths to enemy combatant terrorist deaths in Gaza, for example, is the best ratio, if you like, that we've seen in modern warfare. Is that your belief?
And so I stated that early in the war when there were people doing false comparative analysis.
But do you still believe that about Gaza?
Absolutely.
Okay, so my question for you is very simple then.
It's aggregated.
Okay, but my question for you is very simple.
Piers, what is the...
No, but hang on, John. Let me
Do you
finish
know what the
my question. I will let you
civilian-to-combatant ratio in
answer.
Rafah was?
I will let you answer, but because you've said that, let me just give you my question, which is this.
Sure.
To make that assessment, you would have to know how many civilians have been killed, wouldn't you?
Yep.
So how many is it?
So I take both the numbers that we all have available. I don't filter them through some prism of intentionality and already.
But no pro-Israeli
Israel.
guest has been able to tell me the numbers. So maybe you can enlighten everybody.
No,
How many civilians have been killed in Gaza?
Sure. So I take the Hamas number that they provide, which doesn't distinguish between civilian and combatants, and then I take the one that Israel provides. I have done enough research on all the numbers of any urban battle to understand when do we have a number, and then how is it determined.
Sure. So how many civilians have been killed?
According to Hamas, 72,000.
What is your belief?
My belief is that we don't have a number, but if we take Hamas's number and then we compare it to Israel's numbers of combatants, how many fighters do you think Hamas has, guys?
Okay, let's take the Israel number of combatants. So I've asked Israeli ambassadors how many civilians have been killed. They can always tell me how many Hamas have been killed.
That's right.
But they can never
why?
tell.
They can't tell you how many civilians have died?
Oddly, they can never tell me how many civilians have been killed. So my simple question for you is to make the assessment that the ratio has never been better than it is in Gaza in terms of combatants killed compared to civilians. You'd have to know both numbers. You have to, right? So my question again is simple: how many civilians have actually been killed in Gaza?
So that would be a question.
You don't know, do you?
Comment.
You don't know.
So when people talk about how many civilians have died, you just started the show talking about an indiscriminate number, a high number of civilians. You too don't have access to information to know that body.
No, but you're the one making the claim that the ratio is the best we've seen. I don't think it's unreasonable. I don't think it's unreasonable, John, in that context of that claim, to simply ask you that obviously to make that assessment, you must know how many civilians have been killed and how many Hamas terrorists have been killed. If you don't know, I don't know how you can make the assessment.
I mean, I guess you could challenge the qualitative analysis of any war in the history of war.
I'm only asking you about your claim. You said it was the best ratio, and yet I'm simply asking you, okay, so what is the ratio? How many civilians? How many Hamas?
And I'm trying to explain to you the qualitative analysis.
But do you know the answer or not?
Yes.
What is it?
It is based on Hamas's number.
No, just give me a number of civilians who've been killed that for you to make your judgment that the ratio is the best in modern times. Okay, that's your claim. I respect your right to have a claim. But to back it up, you have to know the two numbers. You have to be able to tell me this number of civilians were killed and this number of Hamas. And then we can all decide whether that is the best ratio of modern times. But if you don't know, now's your chance to say, actually, I don't know. Because I don't think you do you?
So that's an interesting viewpoint. If you didn't know that I'm comparing the numbers we all have available to the same numbers that we all have available.
Right, so how many civilians have been killed? You said you're a scholar of war. So as a scholar of war who says the ratio has never been better, last time, how many civilians have been killed?
So let's talk in the Battle of Rafah.
No, let's talk about in Gaza since October the 7th.
Yeah.
In the war, how many civilians have been killed?
If you just do literally like my kindergartner math of the numbers that are available and subtract the number of combatants, because there are no civilians in war, Piers. There's combatants or non-combatants. Non-combatants are those that are not participating in the war, such as in Gaza. If you're holding a civilian and you're a doctor,
but John, just to be clear, do you have a number or not?
50,000 minus the number of combatants that the IDF have set.
50,000 is what? What number is that?
It is the number that Hamas says is left over of the number of combatants that Israel says.
Sorry,
You,
so how
you
many,
want to throw
so
out-
just to be clear, how many,
Yeah.
you don't want to use the word civilians, how many non-combatants have been killed? I'm struggling to get my head around your maths.
According to Hamas, all of the deaths are non-combatants.
Okay, so how many do
So
you think it,
72,000 according to Hamas.
how many do you think it is?
It's less the number that
Well, how many
Israel
is it,
has
John?
public.
I mean, to have said the ratio's the best we've seen, you've got to know the number. And if you don't know the
So,
number, obviously your
let's quote
assessment
me-
is bullshit.
Piers. So sure, if the entire history of war is bullshit, every case.
I'm not talking about the entire history of war. You said you're a war
World War
scholar.
II,
You've been
Piers,
to
how many
Gaza
civilians
6
died in World
times.
War II,
Right?
Piers?
You have stated
How do you know?
the ratio is the best we've seen. I've asked you multiple times how many civilians have been killed, and you don't know. Therefore, you don't know the ratio. Therefore, your assessment is bullshit.
Sure, Piers. The entire study of war is bullshit.
I wasn't talking about the entire study of war. I was simply talking about the war in Gaza. John Spencer, thank you very much.
But you
We've run
say
out of time, I'm
civilians have
afraid. But
died.
I gave you multiple chances to answer, and you couldn't answer. But I appreciate you coming on the show. Thank you very much.
Let me start with the claim itself, because you have to hear how big it is before you watch it fall apart. John Spencer doesn't hedge. He tells Piers flatly that Israel and the IDF have implemented more measures to prevent civilian harm than any military in history, and that the resulting ratio of civilians to combatants killed is the best we've seen in modern warfare. That's not a vague impression. That's a specific, falsifiable, mathematical claim. And a ratio, by definition, needs two numbers. You cannot know you have the best ratio in modern history without knowing what the ratio actually is. So Piers does the simplest thing a journalist can do. He asks for the numbers. And watch what happens, because this is the whole video in miniature. Piers doesn't attack the politics. He doesn't argue about occupation or self-defense or Hamas. He just asks, how many civilians have been killed in Gaza? A number, Spencer? By his own account, should have. 100 interviews, 6 trips into Gaza, division commanders, battalion commanders, company commanders, all primary source, all logged for a public expose he says took months. If anyone should have the number, it's him. He doesn't have it. Watch what he does instead. First, credentials. I've interviewed more people than your last guest. I've been inside the war zone. I've watched commanders operate. None of that is a number. Then he pivots to Hamas's own figure, 72,000, but immediately undercuts it, saying it doesn't distinguish civilians from combatants, so it's useless for the exact ratio he already claimed to know. Then comes the line that should be the headline of this video, 50,000 minus the number of combatants that the IDF have set. Sit with that sentence. That is not a number. That is a formula with 2 unknown variables presented as if it were an answer. Piers has to ask 3 more times just to get Spencer to admit the word he's avoiding, non-combatants. And even then, when pushed to just say a figure, Spencer eventually offers 2,000, a number that contradicts everything he'd said moments earlier and that he immediately can't defend either. Here's the moment that matters most, and it's worth slowing down on. Piers doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't call Spencer a liar outright. He just keeps rephrasing the same question, calmly, 5 separate times. To make the claim you made, you need to know this number. Do you know it? And every single time, Spencer answers a different question. The number of interviews he's done, the definition of a combatant, a comparison to the Korean War, anything except the figure his own claim depends on. That's not an argument. That's what it looks like when someone realizes, in real time, on camera, that the claim they walked in with cannot survive the first follow-up question. I want to be precise about why this matters beyond one awkward interview. This is exactly how confident, credentialed-sounding claims move through the world unchallenged. Somebody with a title, War Scholar, Executive Director, Urban Warfare Institute, says a number with total conviction. Nobody in the room asks for the receipt. It gets repeated, cited, tweeted, treated as settled fact. The only reason this one didn't survive is that Piers refused to move on to the next topic. He just sat in the silence and asked again. That is such a low bar for journalism, and it's exactly the bar that so rarely gets cleared. And notice the tell at the very end, because it's the same one you've seen from every guest who gets cornered like this. When Piers asks the direct question one final time, "You don't know, do you?" Spencer doesn't say no. He says, "Sure, Piers, that the entire study of war is, and trails into a sentence about the whole history of warfare, as if the scale of the topic excuses him from answering about this specific one. That's the exact move Stephen Moore made with slogans, the exact move Michael Gove made with cranes. When the specific number is the problem, you zoom out to the general principle. Piers doesn't let him zoom out. He brings it back to Gaza every single time. Let me bring this down to what it actually means. Best ratio in modern warfare is not a small phrase. It gets repeated on television, in op-eds, in the mouths of officials, as proof that extraordinary care is being taken with civilian life. And the person whose credibility that phrase rests on. 6 trips to Gaza, 100 interviews, the executive director of an actual institute, cannot tell you the numerator or the denominator. If the person making the claim doesn't have the number, the claim isn't a fact. It's a talking point wearing a lab coat. So here's where this lands. Piers Morgan didn't win this exchange with a clever line or a gotcha edit. He won it by asking one honest question and refusing to accept anything else as an answer. 5 times. That's it. That's the whole method. And a war scholar with every credential in the room could not survive it. If you believe a claim this big deserves a number this basic before anyone repeats it, subscribe to The Honest Perspective. We ask the simple question, and we keep asking it until someone actually answers. I'm Neil. He had the credentials, the interviews, the trips to Gaza. He just didn't have the number. That's The Honest Perspective, and that's where I'll leave you.